Um, Dear Andreas, when you wrote to me for finding an argument for the 3 lectures, I did not imagine that I had to lecture in such a place, a museum, a great museum, full of treasures and full of beauties. So, first of all, I thank you all of your hospitality, but also I must confess I am troubled to show such images in such a place. Yes, I am troubled because, how can I say? I can apologize, as I did yesterday, apologize for the cruelty of such topics, but also perhaps now we are here in a museum, in a great museum, and I have the feeling that since I was trained as an art historian, perhaps there is it's like a symptom that an art historian decides to speak about such things which have nothing to do with art. They have something to do with forms. I told you yesterday how it was linked to the concept, the Warburgian concept of pathos formel, how a force for uprising takes form. And I said also how these topics has to do with the concept of Nachleben, the Warburgian concept of Nachleben. But showing these images here makes me clear that it deals with forms, but not artistic forms. It deals with aesthetics in the sense, perhaps, I just, speaking just before, I remembered that the famous book by Kant on aesthetics is also a book on ethics. So I apologize for the ugly, the terrible images I will show, but I consider it's a symptom, perhaps, that today an art historian has to confront this kind of problems, perhaps. It's a way of... Okay, so the situation, because probably some people here were not in the audience yesterday, it's about Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943. I began yesterday, and today I will develop how a courage, ethical courage, can develop. First, I want to summarize 3 very modest types of revolt as they occurred in the souls of civilians, and I will describe 3 paradigmatic figures who left a considerable impact within the ghetto walls, since my argument is how to uprise when you are back to the wall, dos au mur, we say in French. First, a poet, second, a fool, third, an historian. The poet does not have a precise name. Here are books by the poet, the famous poet Itzhak Katzenelson, which were in the few bookstores in the ghetto, but many other poets, many anonymous, most often anonymous, by the way. They fully adopted the same ethical position, which is the position of the storyteller, which Walter Benjamin, in a famous essay, discussed so well in 1936, when pointing to the figure of the storyteller as the just man, as well as to the unsettling authority of the dying man. In Benjamin's words, I quote, "The epic poet tells a story that resembles the seeds of grain which have lain for centuries in the chambers of the pyramids, shut up airtight, seeds that have retained and conserved their potencies of germination to this day." End of quotation. It is not striking to see exactly the same image in a poem written in the Vilna ghetto by Abraham Sutzkever in March 1943, a poem entitled "Grain of Wheat." I quote, "Perhaps these words will endure and live to see the light loom, and in the destined hour will unexpectedly bloom. And like the primeval grain of the pyramids that turned into a stalk, perhaps these words will be nourishing, perhaps these words will belong to the people." And by the way, Benjamin said that the storyteller, much more than the novelist, is close to the people. Something similar can be heard in an anonymous Hasidic chant quoted by Henry Minxeles in his book, The Jewish Worker Movement. I quote, "You can bring life back with words, you can bring life back with writing." And let us not forget, amongst many other possibilities, the famous poem written in January 1943, just after the first uprising, by Václav Schlengel. This work, quoted by Michel Borvix under the title La Marseillaise, Anthem for the Ghetto. I quote, "Then, on that day, that is in January 1943, at dawn in the early mist, pouncing like hyenas on a city still sleeping, encircling the workers' blockhouses and surrounding all the survivors, suddenly, without warning, the cattle woke up and bared their fangs. The first shot was heard on Mila Street, etc." No, I quote, "We beg you, Lord, for a bloody battle. We implore you for a violent death. Before the end, let our eyes not see the rails dragging people away, but give the hand unerring aim, O Lord," etc. Another figure, civilian figure of this uprising, somewhat more ridiculous, so to speak, more choreographic, more theatrical, is that of the fool, I would say, le fou, a word that takes on irresolvable ambiguities when we speak of a psychotic person, a fool. Fatally, the fool is telling the truth. And that one of the clown, the comedian, the king's jester, who ironically tell the truth. This figure was called Rubinstein. Nobody remembers his first name. He was mentioned in the chronicles written by Jonas Turkov and Hillel Seidman. He was further immortalized by prominent writers such as Itzhak Katzenelson. People gave him money in the ghetto streets. He assailed the crowd, crying with boisterous laughter, "Death to Hitler." He was always surrounded by children, according to the testimonials of Micheline Weinstock, for example. He produced grotesque gesticulations reminiscent of the festive traditions of Purim, much like those of Yiddish theater, or even like some of Shakespeare's clowns. And not by chance, ghetto playwrights loved putting Shakespeare's comical characters on stage at this moment. Rubinstein was especially known for his dancing in the street, as this is the only one photograph taken of this man, as he yelled out in such an overpowering or salutary fashion. No one really knew for sure how to categorize it. He screamed, "And now we are all equal." Perhaps he was communist. We don't know. The third non-military figure of the uprising is that of an historian. I am now referring to a fascinating personality admired by everyone who either knew him personally or had just heard about him. His name, Emanuel Ringelblum. This man was unable to escape death in his double role of insurgent and chronicler, trapped as he was in 1944 by the Nazis inside his minuscule and overcrowded hideaway, where, despite all obstacles, he continued to write. In a magnificent book, the title of which is "Who Will Write Our History?", Samuel Kassow reminds us of Ringelblum's double training, first as an historian working with primary source material. To this extent, he is not unlike modern historiographers such as Marc Bloch or Abi Warburg, let us say, and second, as a militant of the Zionist Socialist Party, Poalei Zion, where he was greatly influenced by Dovber Boroshoff. In the secret places of the ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum founded the group known as Oneg Shabbos, that means joy of the Shabbat, which is very ironic because they had meetings for working on Saturday. So it was ironic. And it is here that he would undertake the considerable task, taking enormous risk of putting together a collection of approximately 25,000 pages of material that would serve as the historical archive of the Jews living, or should we say surviving, in the Warsaw ghetto. This is the French edition. This is examples of such documents in this archive. With the help of several other contributing comrades, Ringelblum would compile some thousands of documents of every imaginable kind: official texts, political tracts, articles from the Jewish press, personal letters, children's homework from their clandestine schools, answers given in response to special inquiries, and also, this is very new, a Polish historian told me some weeks ago, photographs. So there is a new something to look for. Other than serving as an obvious and fundamental source of information about the annihilation of the Jews of Poland, the documentation collected by Ringelblum can also be read as an anthropological study of the forms of survival in both senses, both meanings, not only in the English sense of the word survival, not only in the sense of Überleben, but also because it is about how things were organized on a daily basis, oftentimes with supreme poetry. When you were living your life in the ghetto with your back to the wall, this archive also brings insight into the meaning of the word survival in another sense. Not only survival but afterlife, not only Überleben but Nachleben. We see this second meaning of survival when someone about to leave for Treblinka desperately throws a piece of paper in the air. This is the document on the right, from the cattle car of the train, and when this same piece of paper is picked up by someone else, no one knows exactly who, thus allowing an historical link to be preserved between a person who was destined not to survive, Überleben, and his or her cry for help, which, thanks to Ringelblum, can still be heard today. Seeing that its time was about to run out, the Oynek Shabbos buried its entire stash of documents hidden in tin containers and milk jugs in 1943, and which on September 18, 1946, with the help of some of the rare survivors from the ghetto who knew of this hiding spot, principally Erschwasser and his wife Bluma, were retrieved from under the rubble. Needless to say, Ringelblum's deeds were not in themselves conducive to the uprising in any normal sense of the word. It was not a direct political action, but it was a political gesture, of course. And yet, by putting together a documented chronicle of the Warsaw ghetto in an attempt to convey after his own death and that of an anti-population what these people in the inside had experienced, Ringelblum was indeed making time, history, rise up from the past. He acted as he did, and with such amazing courage, because he found himself in the same way, once again, as someone like Walter Benjamin, at a strange crossroads, absolutely non-orthodox, which crossed a written tradition, a Jewish one, with the writing of a material and even materialist history. On the one hand, Ringelblum compares himself with a scribe copying the Torah. I quote, "When a sofer, a scribe, accepts the task of copying the Torah, he must respect religious law by taking a ritual bath that will cleanse him both of his filth and his impurities. Taking his pen in hand, the scribe trembles at the thought that the slyest error in his transcription means the destruction of all his work. On the other hand, a material history is revealed by the care with which Ringelblum prepared his documentation, by the attention he paid to social relationships, as well as by his explicitly Marxist and revolutionary point of view. This is why, on the date noted as July to December 1942, his diary, which was published, I suppose there is a German edition, of the Warsaw ghetto, ends more or less with an hymn of praise and, as I spoke yesterday, praise of the young resistant fighters, along which a cry of despair in the face of the enormous despondency felt by the Jews. All of this is written in the choppy style of a man with his back to the wall once again, who knows that he does not have much longer to live. I quote, "They escaped from the wagon, those who had experience, young men. One young man escaped 2 times. The second time, by jumping from a wagon, he helped 8 other springers who jumped after him. The role the youth played, the only ones who remained on the battlefield, they were the romantic dreamers." And he says without any irony. Samuel could not survive the tragedy of the ghetto. The decisions made by the various... this is his style, huh? I am not cutting anything. The attempt to set the ghetto on fire. The resistant appeal on the 6th of September for the populace to resist. Deportation were regarded in the ghetto as Nazi provocation. The attempt to assassinate Serinsky, the chief of the Jewish police. Why? Why did not we resist when they began to deport 300,000 Jews from Warsaw? Why could 50 SS men, some say even fewer, with the help of a division of some 200 Ukrainian guards and an equal number of Lets, carry out the operation so smoothly? The illegals are people who don't have a work card number, people who, according to the law, should have been at the Umschlagplatz, and yet are still alive. How many are there? Nobody knows. There are various estimates. Many people place the number at 7,000. Others estimate 10,000 and even 15,000. The fact is, they are. They actually exist, even if they are only romantic dreamers. I repeat that Ringelblum says this without the slightest negative nuance. Very different from the right-wing Zionist, for example, Hillel Seidman. I referred to Hillel Seidman yesterday, who used a more bitter language, calling them naive Bundists. Okay. Many historians have worked on the creation of the Jewish combat organization. Michel Borvix, Georges Bensoussan, Daniel Blattman, Mary Berg, Michael Zilberberg, Chaim Kaplan, Abraham Levin, Israel Gutman, etc., and some of the chronicles. The Jewish Combat Organization came to be on July 28, 1942. That is to say, and I give you the images of 2 prominent personalities. On the left is Marek Edelman, and on the right, Itzhak Zuckerman, 2 very young people. They were 24 years old at the time. and 2 survivors. So we have the chronicles and the memoir of these people. This meeting in July 1942 was several days after the second mass deportation and after Adam Chernyakov had committed suicide. It's very significant. In his 5 years in the Warsaw Ghetto, in his book, Bernard Goldstein recalls that from then on, the only battle cry would be, take up arms. So this is the transition between passive resistance to active resistance, civil resistance to military resistance. The formal founding of the Jewish Combat Organization finally occurred on October 20 of 1942. And now, as Goldstein writes, the ghetto was getting ready for a struggle unto death. And such an expression was surely not intended in the Hegelian sense, but rather meant to suggest a desperate battle, no recognition, of course, which with everyone's back to the wall, a struggle in which death left no alternative. Different mini-factions began to meet and to organize the distribution of firearms as well as the manufacturing of homemade explosives. At that time, the Jewish resistance numbered no more than 750 fighters. That's all. 500 from the GCO, the Jewish Organization, Combat Organization, and 250 of the Jewish Military Union, which was the organization of right-wing revisionists, so to speak, Zionists. And they did not communicate too much. According to Marek Edelman, the typical fighter of the GCO had only one handgun, 10 to 15 bullets, 4 or 5 hand grenades for combat against the German army. Whether we follow the stories told by Itzhak Zuckerman or those of Simrat Roten, for example, and another one, whether we rely on the writings of Marek Edelman or Bernard Goldstein, in every case, the reader is struck by the same sudden burst of despair and the same influx of common energy. All this in a situation where no one calculates what the chances are for success or for failure. First published in 1945, so just at the end of the war, The Ghetto Fights is an internal report prepared by Marek Edelman, I repeat, 24 years old, for the political army of the Bund. In a cold style, Edelman described the mass terror, the progressive mobilization of organized youth, political and editorial activism. Here we include newspaper, Der Werker, Zeitfragen, etc. All of this not in German but in Yiddish, of course. The difficulties of smuggling firearms, the call to dissolve all institutions, especially the Jewish police, and last but not least, the final battles of January and then April, May 1943. The tone of this writing is implacable. In all of this, Edelman never forgets to mention people's general frame of mind. He writes, "No, we are not afraid, and we cannot be surprised. We are merely waiting for the right moment. That's all." In fact, it is rather the Germans, the German army, with their uncompromising power, who were surprised and who felt afraid to the point of pretending to be willing to negotiate at a certain moment in the face of this undeniable potency of insurrection. We can discuss later, if you want, about my use of the difference between power and potency. It could be a topic for discussion. I quote from Edelman, "The sniper's stand was so determined that the Germans were finally forced to abandon all ordinary fighting methods and to try a new, apparently infallible tactics. Their new idea was to set fire to the anti-brush makers' block from the outside on all sides simultaneously. But even in the most difficult moment, when there was almost nothing left, Abrachabloung, an old man, kept our spirits up." So this is interesting, the old man with the young fighters. The old man does not fight. He's too old. But, he says, even if he did not fight himself, his presence among us meant more to us and gave us more strength than the possession of the best possible weapons. One can hardly speak of victories when we are fighting for life itself with our backs to the wall, and when so many people are being lost. But one thing can surely be stated about the particular battle is that we did not let the Germans carry out their plans. We were all fighters for the same just cause, all equal in the face of history, all equal in the face of death. Every drop of blood was of precisely the same value. For his part, Bernard Goldstein wrote, I quote, that every survivor from the ghetto became a resistance fighter, transforming, this is the fact, transforming every bit of his or her pain into an arm for combat. This is the crucial point, the transformation between pain, so to speak, and into uprising. He tells the story of the Second Armed Uprising, beginning on April 19 of 1943, describing in particular the incendiary tactics adopted by the Nazis against the guerrilla resistance put up by the Jewish combat organizations. I don't quote this long quotation, and I come back now to the champ contre champ, to the other place which is in front. As was often the case during the Second World War, German soldiers documented the progress of their ghetto campaigns both internally and administratively. They compiled statistics and took photographs. Of course, we have no images from the resistance. They have no time for this. We have images from the Wehrmacht. So we must confront these images. In May 1943, after the zone has been completely destroyed and emptied by the of its inhabitants, the SS General Jürgen Stroop, commander of the counter-insurrectional forces, wrote a detailed report. The general is here, and this is the report. At the request of his hierarchical superior in Poland, Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, which he addressed to Heinrich Himmler. 3 copies of this report were kept in different archives, each copy accompanied by some 50 snapshots taken during the military operations. According to the historian, the Polish historian Magdalena Kunika-Wierzykowska, quoted also by other historians, the person who took these pictures was probably an SS lieutenant by the name of Franz Conrad. The latter would have photographed General Stroop surrounded by his military staff, would have observed apartment buildings being systematically burned, and the endless queues of arrested Jews, seen the German machine guns in action, and their cannons reducing walls to rubble. Even though his pictures were taken with a purely technical as well as tactical purpose in mind, he left an account of a human living space being pulverized to the point of non-existence. On the operational level, things were both simple and absolutely terrifying. All the Jews had their back to the wall, whatever that wall might be. There could be no mercy. In the legends written to the picture assembled by Jürgen Stroop, one read such words as Jewish rabbits, for example, or just spooked from their burrows. In fact, once the insurgents had been ripped out their hiding places, there were then, if we may use such a vulgar expression, passed on the wall, collés au mur, we say in French. In other words, executed. All the other, more than 56,000 Jews, as the general writes in his report, were then led to their death in an equally systematic fashion. Stroop, as we know, also had another more subjective way of describing his Großaktion in Warsaw, as he called it, a viewpoint that revealed itself under extraordinary circumstances. I have to just, and of course, this report contains the most famous photograph of this time, this famous photograph. Let us say, after his arrest at the end of the war, and during his incarceration in Mokotów, a Warsaw prison, Stroop would later be sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1956. But he began in 1949 to tell his story in private to a fellow prisoner. The irony of history, so it's a way to have the images in mind and to understand what is the discourse of the general about this action. The irony of history would have it that his neighbor, Kazimierz Moczarski, had been a Polish resistance fighter in the Interior Army. But in 1949, he was sent to prison because he was suspected anti-communism actions. So it's ironic, but rather than seeking revenge on Stroop, Moczarski preferred to take careful notes of what the latter told him, all of which published in a book, incredible book, entitled Conversations with an Executioner. Stroop is very proud of what he did in Warsaw Ghetto. He speaks himself as an artist. It's very strange. He say I was creative. I create. I was creative in the role played in the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto. What he meant by this word, creative, was that faced with the surprising situation created by the revolt, the insurrection, the uprising, he had been obliged to invent brilliant new techniques for conducting urban warfare. He talks about checking sites out in the first stage, that is to say, April 18 of 1943, just the day before. I quote, "I went to visit the future battle zones. Although the streets were deserted, I was overcome by the Jewish stench. The apparent calm alongside with the low number of people indicated to me that the Jews had been warned about our battle plan." Then he recalls a remark he had heard from a soldier stationed near the ghetto wall. The remark was, when are we finally going to start shooting these dirty animals behind the walls of the Jewish zoo? End of quotation. General Stroop writes again, "At 7:30 a.m., so the day after, the assault brigades once again entered the ghetto. I had divided them into groups of 36 men, each headed by an officer and a second in command. I ordered the police chief, Major Sternhagel, to proceed with caution to the zone we had captured the previous day in order to clean up the rest of the ghetto and then to execute thorough and energetic searches of the entire area enclosed by the walls. We were met with a few small pockets of resistance and stumbled on several hideouts tucked away in apartments. Noting that it was the Holy Thursday, just before Easter, Stroop realized on April 22 that he was powerless against the Jews. But he did not stop here. He writes, "We really had a tough time on that Holy Thursday. We were subjected to machine guns attack on several occasions, and we suffered losses both of men and of equipment. My army was beginning to lose his composure. I even noticed several signs of fear. And that is why, after having spoken with Dr. Hahn and with General Krüger, with authorization from Berlin, I decided to burn down all their houses one by one. Fire, smoke, flames, sparks flying in the wind, dust, feathers, the stench of burning objects and corpses, the thunder of cannons and grenades, all this strange light, and then the parachutists." Moczarski in the cell says, "Parachutist? What is it?" Stroop explains, "Parachutist, I mean those Jewish women and children who were jumping to the ground onto the sidewalk of the street, from the windows, balconies, and attics of their houses, whose lower floors were engulfed with flames." Later on, Stroop begins talking about the veritable sea of flames. He described other scenes of horror. I quote precisely because I have to say something about this example. A Jew jumping from walls on fire. His clothes were already burning. He gesticulated like a madman, his face covered in dirt, his hair disheveled and partially burned away. There he was standing for a split second, breathing the burning air. But it was the open air. When he suddenly saw us, he yelled out something, making threats with his hands, then a vulgar gesture, and he took out his pistol, firing at an SS only to throw himself back into the flames. Stroop writes, he preferred to die like that between his own walls. It's again a story of walls. Even in 1949, this General Stroop in his prison is still understood nothing about the desperate acts of the Jewish insurgents. Such a man did not want to die between his own walls. Not at all. Absolutely not. What he wanted, on the contrary, was to break down walls of any and every kind, be they walls of bricks or walls of fire. What he wanted was to pass through walls. His one and only desire was to open up a space of freedom, like we saw yesterday in the publications of the Bund, something that had been so ferociously denied him. When we read the memoirs written by Bernard Goldstein or Marek Edelman, we are struck by the fact that every door had been slammed shut in the face of these freedom lovers. Everyone, everything became a wall. Germans were wall, anti-Semitic Poles, walls, informants, blackmailers, thugs of every sort, smugglers, the Jewish police, dignitaries of the Judenrat, those in charge of Stalinist organization, etc. The fact is that there can be no freedom behind the walls thrust upon you by the police, by an army, by a colonial force, etc. When Marek Edelman dares to speak about love in the ghetto, which is, or about life despite the ghetto, he is always referring to a life in which the only gestures that had any meaning were those that pointed towards an exit. You had to find a way out, or of the deadly trap set by the Nazis, a way out of the fatally bureaucratic maneuver of the Judenrat, to get out from under the spying eyes of so many traitors, to escape from the malevolent order, but also to escape from yourself and from your fears, and to find a way that leads to the benevolent order. My last example, this today. One of the pictures included in the Stroop report, two versions, no doubt taken by an officer SS, or shows a few recently arrested insurgents. In the handwritten report given to the SS, one reads the following words: women captured with weapons in their hands. But here, everyone has their hands raised in surrender. Such gestures, at least for my eyes today, looking at them today, indicates a way out. in part because the powerful desire of the persons making this gesture is already at this time shining through, just as it is today. For sure, these people are cornered, they are goners, and they have backs to the wall. They are really quite already dead. These people are. They know they are already dead. But, and referring to the discussion yesterday about the images stronger than the viewer, this is clear for me, but it can be discussed, that the gestures point to something opening itself up before them. They gesture towards another dimension that, in all likelihood, the Nazis, of course, would have not possibility or time to see. One man raises his arm, but his fist is closed. Is it defiance? Is it communism once again? The two women beside him seemed to be very proud, so very dignified, that their hands seem already open for another spatial dimension. So they yearn for a horizon that is larger than the current situation. This is just an hypothesis, of course. So I'm not sure of this. These are, after all, gestures made by insurgents who have no way out, gestures of desperate people that somehow begin to look like gestures of hope. Hope not for themselves, but for some other person or some other future. In 1947, the Polish prosecutor Piotrowski, quoted by Michel Borwicz in his archival book on the uprising, spoke of the women fighting in the ghetto in terms, I quote, of characters from ancient tragedies, capable of showing magnificent disdain of their oppressors, from whom the only thing they would ever receive was death. Of course, General Stroop had an entirely different point of view, as he saw nothing human either in the women themselves or in their contribution to the uprising. He writes, he says to Moczarski, they were not really human beings, but rather female devils or divinities, always calm, nimble like circus girls. Quite often, they would take their pistols in both hands, steady in combat, willing to fight to the bitter end. This is why I gave the order not to take any more prisoners, not to let them get too close, and to shoot them down from afar with an automatic weapon. End of quote. These people had virtually no chance of survival in this situation in which they found themselves, but this was not a good reason, in the insurgent eyes, for not trying to send their message of dignity beyond the confines of the ghetto walls, beyond the limits. This was the task. As Raoul Hilberg correctly noted in 1994, the Battle of Warsaw Ghetto did not aim to save any Jewish lives, not in the least. It sought rather to re-establish Jewish honor. In the last letters he wrote, Mordecai Anielewicz, I think I have, no, I have not this, his letter, expressed the belief that the battle should now be known beyond the perimeters of the wall. Beyond the perimeters of the wall, this was the problem. It meant we have no more hope for ourselves, but for you, perhaps, you away. Both this warning and this hope for someone else, the hope for another place, the hope for another time, it had always been at the heart of ethical thinking developed just before by Franz Kafka, Ernst Bloch, and Walter Benjamin. From now on, however, these ideas would take on a more tragic profile than in anything of these three pessimistic Jews could ever have imagined. How can you transmit hope from the abyss of utter loss? That was the question. How could a lesson of humanity ever be transmitted when successive appeals from help seem to have been met by dead silence, total indifference of the Western world? We need, just to finish, mention 4 instances. A call was sent by the Bund and the Socialist Party in 1941 and published in New York in a pamphlet, Free Poland, you see on the right. In second example, in 1943, Shmuel Zingelboim left a testimonial letter on his desk just before he committed suicide in London. Third example, Jacob Abensalk, with the support of Albert Einstein, issued an appeal in the Black Book of Polish Jews in 1944, but it was too late. And afterwards, of course, the extremely important mission of Jan Karski. It is not coincidence that Claude Lanzmann would want to conclude his grand work, Shoah, the film, by reuniting 2 survivors from the 1943 uprising. Antek, Itzhak Zuckerman, this is not Antek, this is Shimcha Roten and Itzhak Zuckerman. The resistance put up by the Warsaw Ghetto is paradigmatic of any desperate uprising. There can be no doubt about this, but this uprising was far from representing a unique case. Uprising at Treblinka, August 2nd, 1943. Uprising in Sobibor, October 14 of the same year. Uprisings would also break out. The handwritten pages compiled by the members of the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz-Birkenau may well have been buried underneath the ashes, and their photographic records may well have been blocked during the transmission of the West. Such documents, nevertheless, are part of the archives, and we have an uprising of which Philipp Müller, for example, amongst others, was able to describe as a survivor. It was a matter of getting the documents out of the perimeter of the camp, even if those very persons, I repeat, who produced the documents knew full well that they would never get themselves out. Sorry for the desperation of such a talk. Thank you very much.